Well, it's certainly good to be together this morning to worship with those of like-minded faith. And of course, our desire is to worship our God, who is due the honor and the respect and the adulation that we can give him. We're thankful that you've come to be with us, especially if you're visiting with us this morning. I want to direct your attention to a passage here in Luke chapter 5. At the end of that chapter, verses 30 to 32, Jesus has just called Matthew, or Levi, as Luke names him, and he goes to his house to eat with him. And so verse 29 says, "And Levi made him a great feast in his house, and there was a large company of tax collectors and others reclining at table with them. And the Pharisees and their scribes grumbled at his disciples, saying, 'Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?'" And here was Jesus' response, verse 31. "And Jesus answered them, 'Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick.'" So Jesus was talking about sickness and health, but he wasn't talking about physical disease, was he? He was talking about a spiritual condition. And so this morning we're going to talk for a few minutes about this idea of diagnosing this disease that is amongst us, this problem of sin that we all face. And what Jesus says here is really not that hard or that difficult to understand. What he's saying is, if I feel bad, I go to the doctor. That's when I go. If I get up in the morning and I feel really good, I don't rush to the ER. That's not where I go. But on the other hand, if I am sick and I don't seek out the doctor can't help me. All of that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? But as I suggest, Jesus is talking about this as a spiritual condition and really describing the very setting in which he finds himself. So let's think about that together this morning. How do I know if I'm sick? How do I know if this disease is affecting me? And I want to cite 4 different examples to look at some of those who determined that they were sick. Go back to the start of the chapter 5 in Luke, and you'll notice here that Peter has been out on a boat fishing all night with others, and they haven't caught anything. And Jesus comes to teach, and because the shore is so crowded, he gets into a boat which ends up being Peter's boat, and they move away from the bank so that Jesus can teach. And then when he finishes teaching, he turns to Peter and he says, "I want you to cast your net in this place here." And so Peter, being a fisherman, I don't think this was his first involvement with Jesus. Jesus had had some contact with these men already, but Peter had come to know Jesus. And of course, Peter has been fishing all night, he says, and he hasn't caught anything. And so on the one hand, you might think, who is this upstart coming and telling me where to cast my net? It would be like if you were a really good fisherman, and you might be, and I'm a novice, I don't know anything about it, and I come to your favorite fishing hole and I say, you're not catching many fish there. Why don't you cast your rod over that way? And you'd think, what do you know about catching fish? Peter could have reacted that way to Jesus, but he doesn't. In fact, he says, "I fished all night long, I haven't caught anything, but because you said it at your word, I'll let down my net." And so he does. And then we're told that as they draw up the net, there are so many fish that the boat begins to sink. They had to call others to come and help them. And they were astonished, verse 9 says. But what was Peter's reaction? Did Peter say, "We got to get to market quick. These fish are going to spoil. Let's go sell them. We can make a whole lot of money with these fish"? No, he didn't say that. Did he say, what a wondrous miracle? He was certainly astonished. But look at verse 8. What does he say? He falls down at Jesus' knees and he says, "Depart from me because I'm a sinner." Now you might say, what is the connection between catching fish and being a sinner. Those two don't seem to go together. But I think what Peter recognizes is that if Jesus has the ability to look into that water and see where the fish are and tell him where to cast his net and bring up those fish, then Jesus can look into his heart and see what's there. And Peter, in the presence of the divine, says, Lord, I'm a sinner. In fact, he says, depart from me, a sinful man. Was he aware that he was sick? Most certainly he was. Look at the parable that Jesus tells over in Luke chapter 18, the tax collector or the publican and the Pharisee. And we'll just focus at this moment on verse 13, where as Jesus pictures these two men in the temple praying to God, having mentioned the Pharisee, he turns to the publican or the tax collector, who it says would not lift his eyes up to heaven. He was bowing his head. He beat his breast. And he cries out, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. This man knew he had sinned. He had failed God. And even though he was a tax collector, why he was in cahoots maybe with Rome and he had mischarged people, he was willing to confess his sin and ask his God for forgiveness. He knew he was sick. And then several weeks ago, we talked about Luke 15, another parable about the prodigal, and that younger son who asked for his father's inheritance, and his father grants it to him. And then he goes off into a far country, it says, and he wastes his living, profligate life. That's what the prodigal means, wasteful living. And then he finds himself in the pig pen feeding the pigs. He doesn't have anything to eat. He's in want. And then it says he came to himself. And he said, my father has servants who have more than I do. And so I'm going to go home and I'm going to say, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. And then he follows through with it. He does what he said he was going to do. And so this prodigal recognizes that he is sinful. He needs forgiveness, certainly from his father, but even from God. And then finally, an example back from the Old Testament. If you want to turn back to Isaiah chapter 6, this is the chapter in Isaiah where he receives his commission from God to go and prophesy to the people. Isaiah chapter 6, starting at verse 1, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne. Now, Isaiah is either seeing a vision or maybe he's actually seeing this throne. Was it in the temple? Some have suggested, well, this was even heaven in some way or shape or form. We're not told, but it says, the train of his robe filled the temple. Back in 1981, Levon and I moved over to England, and one of the things we did that summer was to watch this grand royal wedding between Prince Charles and Diana. And I still remember Diana walking up the steps to St. Paul's Cathedral, and here was this train that was stretching down the steps. Very grand. Isaiah says, I saw this throne, and the train filled the temple. Can you imagine that? A train that fills St. Paul's. And then he says, above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Here are the angels shouting their praise. To say it 3 times is to really emphasize that. Verse 4, and the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. Imagine that picture that Isaiah saw. And how did he react? Look at verse 5. And I said, woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Isaiah, in the presence of deity, in the presence of God himself, says, I'm unclean. And God proceeds to cleanse him and then to send him to his people, Israel, who he says aren't going to listen to what you have to say, but I want you to go anyway and preach to them. And so let me just ask, what did those four examples have in common? Well, what stands out is that they recognized what they had done against God. They realized their condition. They're sick. In the case of the prodigal and the publican, people that we might think of as immoral and kind of unconcerned with God. In the case of Peter and Isaiah, people who were set upon doing the will of God, and yet they both come to the same conclusion. Now let's just for a moment compare these to kind of their opposites in each case. We don't have one in the case of Peter, but I'm going to start with Israel. I didn't mean to start with all of them, but I'll just go ahead and we'll look at all of them. Back in Isaiah chapter 1, listen to what Isaiah says as he addresses his people. Isaiah 1 and verse 3, the ox knows its owner and the donkey its master's crib, but Israel does not know, my people do not understand. What's he saying? I've told you before about going out to Colorado. My brother and his wife have some horses there they like to ride. Levon likes to ride, so she goes and rides with the grandkids. And one of our chores, if my brother's not there, is to go feed the horses. And so you can get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and it's freezing cold outside. And here I am, someone who hasn't been around them at all. And as soon as I walk out the door, what do you think those horses start doing? They start pacing, going back and forth. They're pawing. They're at their troughs waiting for the food to be delivered. They know where the food comes from. Isaiah says, the ox knows his owner. The donkey knows its master's crib, but my people don't know me. Astounding, isn't it? I'm the one who's blessed them and given them all they have, and they don't know me. Drop down to verses 5 and 6. He asks, why will you still be struck down? Why will you continue to rebel? The whole head is sick, and the whole heart faint. From the sole of the foot even to the head, there is no soundness in it, but bruises and sores and raw wounds. Picture what he's describing, a person who from head to toe has been battered and is bruised, and yet they don't know they need anything. He says that's Israel. Really the opposite of what we described concerning Isaiah. But let's look a little further. Look at the Pharisee in this parable about the Pharisee and the tax collector. And in verses 11 and 12, it says Jesus pictures this Pharisee as praying like this: God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector over here. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. Now, if you back up to verse 9, Luke tells us that Jesus was telling this parable because there were those who thought of themselves as being righteous and setting others at naught. Who is that? Well, among others, it's the Pharisees and the scribes who knew the law backwards and forwards, and so they would set others at naught. Now, why was that? Well, listen to what he's saying. I don't do bad things like others do. Can you imagine that? I'm not like others. Are we not all like others in many respects? But I'm just. I don't take things from people. I haven't committed adultery. And I do some really good things. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I get. You know, fasting really was not commanded in the law except on one day, one time. The Day of Atonement. Afflict yourselves, God said. And all those other fasts, not that it wasn't acceptable and maybe good to do, but God hadn't commanded it. But this Pharisee is proclaiming, I fast twice in the week and I give tithes of everything. Reminds us of Jesus over in Matthew chapter 23 when he was talking to the scribes and Pharisees. He says in verse 23, "Woe to you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness." It's not that tithing those little elements, spices, God doesn't say, well, just quit doing that. But he says, don't overlook the bigger things, justice, mercy, faithfulness. And he says, these you ought to have done without neglecting the others. They're both important, aren't they? Kind of reminds me of Jesus on the Sabbath day. A couple of cases in Luke again. Chapter 14, a man with dropsy. That was a man had too much fluid in his body. And so he says, basically, is it okay to heal on the Sabbath? And they don't say anything. And so he heals the man, and he does so saying, if it were your son or your animal, would you not rescue him out of a well? Note the similarity, a well in which someone is drowning. Here's this man who's drowning from the fluid in his body. And Jesus says, isn't it good to do that on the Sabbath? He's not violating the Sabbath. He's doing good. Can you imagine the Pharisees saying, aha, we've caught him this time. He's healing someone on the Sabbath. How does that sound? And yet often that was their mindset. Well, one other example. Look at that older brother in Luke chapter 15. And notice the Pharisees had grumbled there, verses 1 and 2, because Jesus was having association with these sinners and tax collectors. And he describes that older brother who was angry and unforgiving. He wouldn't go into that feast that his father was having for his younger brother. He thought he had deserved his father's favor. I've served you this many years. He had an inflated view of his obedience. I've never violated one of your commands. And he was both envious and ungrateful as far as what his brother was getting that his father hadn't done for him. I think we can all see the picture that develops here. They're just kind of like opposites from the right hand and the left hand there. Those who recognize their sin and those who seemingly don't. And so what's the difference? Well, it's not that they didn't realize they were sinners. I think we've said in the case of these, yes, they recognize that. Do you think these others would have said, no, we have never sinned against God? I don't think they would have said that. But for all these other reasons, they thought of themselves as being pretty good, pretty righteous, pretty good standing with God. And so we can treat others accordingly. Well, very quickly, let me just suggest the attitudes of each of these. On the hand of those who thought of themselves as righteous, notice that they like to compare themselves to others. And that's easy to do, isn't it? You start finding someone who might not measure up like you think you do, and so you compare yourself to them. What's wrong with that picture? I don't compare myself to this person. I need to compare myself to God's standard. And then it seems that their religion had become more a matter of what we'd say checking the boxes. You know, here are the requirements. Did I do those? Okay, I've done those. I'm good. And we all know that a relationship with God, yes, we have to obey commands. And in that sense, yes, we check certain boxes, but that's not the whole relationship, is it? Think about our relationships with our spouses, Are those just a matter of checking certain responsibilities and fulfilling certain? Isn't the relationship more than that? Or with our children? Yes, we want them to obey. And yes, we're pleased when they do, but aren't we trying to develop with them a relationship between ourselves and between them? And so it's more than just checking those boxes. And it seems like as a result of all this, they kind of forgave, but in a grudging way, like that older brother, or like that Pharisee in the temple who just treated that tax collector with contempt because of his perceived faithfulness toward God. And I think at the bottom of the list we can put here that they seem to just take the relationship with God for granted. Isn't that what Israel did? Why, we're God's people. God has blessed us. Here's the temple right here amongst us. And that was independent of what it is that they had done, how they thought, how they acted. But now compare that with those that we described at the outset. They had a sense of God's presence. Some were in the presence of God, but an awareness that God is here with us. They had a realization of their sin. We have mentioned that. They were willing to confess what they had done, certainly to God first and foremost. And then they humbly were willing to ask and seek God's forgiveness. It is those attitudes that shape us and shape our relationship with God. And certainly the obedience that accompanies that is very important. We're not trying to minimize that in any way, shape, or form. But it is to say that we understand that we are people in need of God's mercy and His grace. So let me close with these thoughts. As we monitor our spiritual health, as I monitor my spiritual health, can I just point out that I've thought a lot about this. You know, you see these Pharisees and scribes, they knew every detail of the law. Why were they so prone to self-righteousness? Were they just bad people? Well, Paul was a Pharisee. And then when Jesus appeared to him, he realized he was headed the wrong direction, that, yeah, he had all the Jewish credibility, but he did not have the righteousness that he could receive through Jesus and the gospel. I don't think it was that they were bad people. It is that when we decide that we are going to be right with God, there is always the danger. I don't care who you are and where you are, that can become an exercise of self-righteousness. We just have to be aware that that's a possibility. And so, yes, we want to obey God. We can be righteous. John says in 1 John 3, verse 7, "Little children, let no one deceive you. Whoever practices righteousness," possible, "is righteous," we can, "as he is righteous." That's our standard. We're trying to be righteous as God wants us to. But I must compare myself to God's standard and focus on my standing with Him. It's kind of like physical sickness. Would it be right for me to say, I must be pretty healthy because I see someone else out there and I'm not sick as they are? That's not the standard, is it? What are my vitals? What's the lab research on my blood? How am I doing? That's really the thing that tells us. And so we just have to realize that there's always a danger in terms of being right with God, that we can become self-righteous, and we guard against that. Secondly, I would suggest that I've got to maintain that relationship with God. It's something at which we work. Jesus said over in Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, you're going to have to do better than the Pharisees. Your righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. Chapter 5, verse 20. Because he went on to give examples, they say, well, I didn't murder, but I can be angry with my brother. And he gave a lot of other examples. And that's what he was talking about. Really, to be right with God means to seek first his kingdom, his rule in my heart, in his righteousness. And then he says, you don't have to worry about all those other things. God will provide for you what you need. And so as we work at our relationships, we're working at our relationship with God. And then thirdly, I would simply suggest I am always in need of God's mercy. I think that's been highlighted in our service here this morning. Jason's thoughts about the Lord's Supper, Jesus being this advocate, Michael's prayer, asking for God's mercy on our behalf. The need for that mercy doesn't end at baptism. That's really where the road begins. And as I walk and as I gain knowledge, as I gain experience, as I become more faithful, what I understand is that I'm frail and I need God's help every step of the way. And I need his mercy on my behalf. And what that does is that enables me to look at others in a merciful way. And there might be those outside who have never come to know God, and I can act toward them with mercy as much as they might frustrate me at times, because God has been merciful to me. You might think I'm trying to single out a group or a person. That's not the case. I'm speaking to myself this morning. These are principles. They're a part of this righteousness that we each want to develop. And so as we seek to serve God, and as we close this morning, I would simply ask, am I aware of my condition? Maybe you're in this audience and you've never thought of yourself in those terms. Think about what God understands and what his standard is, and see yourself in light of what your responsibility is to him. And then if you're not in a relationship with him, you can become a part of that relationship with all those responsibilities we've talked about. But you can become his child, enjoy the many benefits and the many blessings, and utmost that relationship with him. In way of invitation, we simply ask, am I in need of a doctor? If you're not a Christian, you are in need according to Scripture. And we would beg you to seriously consider your relationship with God. But even as we think of ourselves and that mercy that God provides for us, may we understand our needs on a daily basis, to walk like God wants us to and to be pleasing to him. That is our desire. If you're subject to the invitation this morning, won't you come as together we stand?